November 1944 carried a chill across the vast Pacific, where the ocean stretched in endless swaths of gray and blue, and clouds drifted lazily in a sky heavy with the promise of storms. Lieutenant Commander James, Jimmy, O'Hara adjusted the throttle of his F-6F Hellcat, feeling the vibrations through the controls, the hum of the engine a familiar heartbeat beneath him. Routine strike missions were nothing new to him. He had flown dozens. But the comfort of routine often betrayed a hidden danger, a small crack that could widen into disaster in the blink of an eye. Today, that danger revealed itself with the subtle, terrifying shift of his aircraft's behavior. He had taken off from the USS Essex just before dawn, a crisp morning where the horizon glimmered faintly in cold light. The mission was simple, at least on paper: patrol a swath of ocean near the Mariana Islands, scout for Japanese naval activity, and be ready to strike if necessary. In theory, a routine flight. In reality, the Pacific was a theater where the unexpected became ordinary, and pilots learned quickly that survival was a matter of instincts sharpened by experience. O'Hara had honed those instincts, yet nothing in his training had prepared him for the subtle, horrifying sense that something essential was missing from his plane. It began during a dive maneuver, executed with careful precision over a target zone. He felt the plane's tail vibrate under a strain that was too sudden, too violent. His fingers tightened on the controls as the aircraft shuddered unnaturally, as though some unseen hand had gripped it and twisted it mid-flight. Instruments flickered, warnings chimed faintly, but O'Hara's attention had already focused on the unnatural movement of the plane itself. His stomach knotted as he realized the unthinkable. The tail, the stabilizing anchor of his aircraft, had sheared off. For a moment, disbelief froze him. The tail of a plane is not a cosmetic detail. It is the fulcrum of balance, the rudder of life in 3 dimensions of flight. Without it, the Hellcat was reduced to a terrifying, erratic extension of his own reflexes. He felt the craft lurch violently, swaying like a leaf caught in a storm, and his mind raced through every emergency procedure he had drilled into muscle memory. Bail out? He considered it, briefly, the logic simple and cold. But beneath the thought was the ice-cold fear of plunging into the ocean below, waves hundreds of feet away, carrying the chill of death with them. No, he realized. He would fly this tailless beast. He had to. The carrier deck of the USS Essex stretched beneath him like a fragile promise. In the calm, measured voice of a pilot trained for precision, he muttered under his breath instructions, half to the plane and half to himself: adjust the throttle, tilt wings, compensate for the missing stabilizer. Each input was a delicate negotiation with the laws of physics, each microsecond a gamble. The plane responded with agonizing imperfection, yawing unpredictably, catching winds with a violent, disorienting sway. O'Hara's breath came in controlled bursts, a quiet rhythm he relied on to steady his mind. Every pilot knows that calm in crisis is sometimes the only shield between survival and catastrophe. Below, on the deck, the carrier crew was already moving in response to the emergency. Sailors, trained for hundreds of scenarios, readied crash nets, fire suppression teams, and stretchers. They could not see the exact terror unfolding above them, but instinct told them that what was coming would be unlike anything they had faced. Word had spread up and down the flight deck. O'Hara's coming in, and the tail's gone. A hush fell across the landing area, the kind that presses on ears and hearts alike. The crew, like O'Hara, waited, suspended in a moment that stretched with the tension of fate itself. O'Hara's eyes scanned the deck. Even in his peripheral vision, he noted the subtle movement of the carrier, the slight roll as it responded to ocean swells. A tiny miscalculation in angle, a misjudged gust, and the plane could either miss the deck entirely or crash into it with devastating consequences. He thought briefly of the men in his squadron, of comrades who had not returned from missions, and of the family photographs tucked safely in his flight jacket. There was no time to dwell, only action mattered. His hands, white at the knuckles, adjusted the yoke, the throttle, and the rudder pedals, each movement calculated, each response measured against a backdrop of death and wind. The wind tugged, playful and cruel, testing every ounce of his skill. O'Hara leaned into the controls, whispering to himself almost in prayer. Steady, steady. The plane, though mutilated, obeyed enough to stay airborne. He had learned to read it like an extension of his body, anticipating its sways, its quirks, its violent desires to throw him into the sea. Inch by inch, he navigated toward the deck, each moment a testament to years of experience, and the thin thread of luck that keeps even the most skilled pilot alive. And then, in a brief, surreal instant, O'Hara glimpsed the deck fully. It seemed impossibly small from the air, moving beneath him in a rhythm both terrifying and hypnotic. The horizon trembled with waves, and the sky, painted in the faint light of dawn, reminded him of how precarious the moment was. But with every beat of his heart, he pushed forward. He could not imagine what it would feel like to miss the deck, to descend into the cold embrace of the Pacific, and yet there was no alternative. The tailless Hellcat had only one destination, the carrier beneath him. Somewhere deep inside, beyond fear, doubt, and the gnawing awareness of mortality, O'Hara felt a resolve solidify. He would land this plane. He would survive. And if he did, the story of this flight, impossible, improbable, miraculous, would ripple through the carrier, whispered in awe and disbelief for years to come. For now, though, there was no time to think about stories. There was only the deck, the wind, the trembling fuselage, and the will to control what should not be controllable. Somehow, with no tail to stabilize the aircraft, he pulled the throttle back, feeling the plane sway like a leaf in a storm. Below, the deck of the carrier seemed impossibly small, almost unreachable. And yet, he had no choice. If he couldn't land, he wouldn't survive the ocean. If he couldn't land, he wouldn't survive the ocean. Every instinct screamed to bail out, yet Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara refused. The Pacific stretched beneath him like a steel-gray mirror, endless and unforgiving. There was no margin for error, no room for hesitation. The Hellcat trembled violently, rudderless, wingtip wavering, a machine defying the laws of aerodynamics. And yet, he had only one course: control the uncontrollable. The first challenge was balance. With the tail gone, the plane's center of gravity had shifted in ways that textbooks could not anticipate. The aircraft pitched unpredictably with the slightest input of throttle, veered at the gentlest tilt, and rolled with a subtle threat of disaster. Each maneuver required a delicate negotiation, an almost imperceptible counterweight of body, minute shifts in throttle, small banking corrections, all executed with near meditative focus. Every second mattered, every miscalculation could be fatal. He whispered instructions to himself, not prayers, but precise commands. Throttle up, slight left, steady. Each word anchoring him to the present, to the only reality he could control. O'Hara's training and countless hours in flight came alive as muscle memory. He had flown formation flights with other pilots, executed dive-bombing runs, and survived near misses in dogfights. Yet none of those experiences prepared him for a scenario where physics itself seemed to rebel. He was no longer simply piloting an aircraft. He was negotiating with the forces of wind, gravity, and chaos, coaxing a mutilated plane across hundreds of feet of open air. There was no textbook for this, no rehearsal. Only instinct, experience, and a resolute refusal to fall into the sea. Beneath him, the USS Essex loomed larger, the deck moving gently with the undulating ocean. He could see the crew now, tiny figures in life jackets, bracing against the possibilities. Nets were raised, crash teams gathered, and all the eyes of the flight deck were fixed skyward. O'Hara knew they had little faith in the survivability of a tailless Hellcat, but he could not afford their fear to penetrate his mind. He focused on the plane, on the minute adjustments that kept it from spinning out of control. One wrong twitch of the yoke, one misjudged gust of wind, and the aircraft would tumble, a deadly spiral toward water or steel. The wind, mischievous and mercurial, seemed almost sentient. It tested him, pushing against his instincts, tugging the plane with invisible hands. He compensated with gentle yet precise corrections, banking slightly, adjusting throttle by fractions, letting the aircraft dance on the edge of chaos. Every vibration, every shudder was a signal, a warning, a guide. He listened to the plane as one listens to a living thing, feeling its subtle desires, coaxing it, commanding it, bending it to survive. The sense of control was tenuous, fragile, yet somehow present. O'Hara also had to contend with fear. Not the paralyzing, mindless terror that would make a pilot panic, but a keen, penetrating awareness of mortality. He felt it in his bones, in the way his hands gripped the yoke, in the shallow, controlled rhythm of his breathing. Yet fear, harnessed properly, became focus. Each wave of adrenaline sharpened his perception, made him aware of subtleties in airflow and the carrier's motion. He reflected fleetingly on the letters tucked into his flight jacket pocket, notes from loved ones, reminders of home, family, and friends. They were ghosts of comfort, anchors to humanity as he faced the absurdity of controlling a plane stripped of its tail. Minutes stretched like hours. Inch by inch, O'Hara edged closer to the carrier, negotiating the final approach with a combination of calculation and instinct. His eyes, trained to detect the smallest visual cues, tracked the deck's motion against the horizon, noting every swell, every subtle tilt. The Hellcat wavered as the wind caught a wingtip, threatening to spin him off course, but he countered immediately, coaxing the plane back into line. The entire flight was a delicate ballet, one step away from catastrophe. He thought of the words an instructor had once said, "You do not fly the plane, you negotiate with it. Every movement matters." Below, the crew could see the plane's eerie stability in defiance of its mutilated form. Gasps and murmurs echoed across the deck. Some sailors held their breath, hands frozen in midair, as if their collective hope could influence the plane's behavior. Others whispered prayers for the pilot they had trusted. They had seen dangerous landings, engine failures, and crash-prone takeoffs, but never a machine stripped of its tail defying destruction with a pilot at the helm. Each second stretched painfully as the Hellcat edged closer, a fragile thread suspended between life and death. The plane shuddered violently as a gust of wind struck squarely on the port wing. O'Hara felt it nearly toss him into oblivion, yet he countered immediately, hands working in concert with instinct. The throttling, the minor bank, the delicate tilt, all gestures now amplified by circumstance, kept the aircraft from spinning entirely. A wave of calm washed over him. Not triumph, not relief, but focus, absolute and unyielding. The ocean below shimmered with frostlight, a silent witness to a miracle in slow motion. The deck ahead no longer seemed distant. It was attainable, a narrow bridge between survival and disaster. And he would not let it slip away. He lined up with the carrier, wings trembling, engines straining. Every second felt like an eternity. The deck was moving beneath him, yet for a brief moment, time seemed suspended. And then, a sudden gust threatened to fling him off course entirely. Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara tightened his grip on the yoke, muscles taut, eyes scanning the horizon. The carrier stretched ahead like a fragile promise of survival, its steel deck moving in rhythm with the Pacific's restless waves. Every inch of his approach demanded perfect coordination. Too fast, and he would overshoot. Too slow, and the plane would stall, plummeting helplessly into the cold expanse below. The Hellcat, stripped of its tail, trembled beneath him, each shudder a whispered warning of the consequences awaiting a single miscalculation. The wind shifted unpredictably, teasing and testing. A cross gust pushed the fuselage toward the starboard side, and O'Hara instinctively countered, banking the plane slightly, throttling with precision, coaxing the aircraft back into alignment. He felt every vibration through his palms, every subtle change in the wing's tension, as though the plane itself were a living creature, screaming for guidance. One false movement could trigger disaster. Yet, despite the chaos, the carrier deck grew larger with every passing second, its crew tiny figures readying for the improbable. Below, sailors held their collective breath. Nets were raised along the deck, fire crews crouched by, and officers gestured urgently, signaling to the plane above. Some whispered fervent prayers, others cheered silently, their hope and fear entwined in the same heartbeat. They had been briefed on standard landings, on emergencies, on crashes, but nothing in any manual accounted for a plane without a tail descending upon them, and yet here it was, a single pilot navigating a twisted, broken aircraft, bending physics with sheer will. O'Hara's mind was a focused lens, stripping away all extraneous thought. He calculated distance, angle, descent rate, wind speed, all in a continuous stream of internal arithmetic. He had no instruments to stabilize him fully. The artificial horizon and gauges were unreliable under the violent oscillations. Instead, he relied on instinct, training, and the intimate knowledge of his plane's capabilities. Every correction, every micro-adjustment, became a negotiation with the unpredictable, a conversation with danger itself. He thought briefly of the thousands of flights he had taken before, of the countless hours spent perfecting maneuvers and training, of comrades lost to the ocean or fire. Those memories, once abstract, now anchored him in purpose. Fear was present, sharp and clear, yet it did not dominate. It sharpened his senses, made him alive to the imperceptible cues of the plane, the wind, and the deck below. Every minute, every second, was an extension of a larger rhythm, the balance between life and death suspended on a knife edge. The carrier deck surged beneath him as the vessel rolled slightly on a passing swell. O'Hara adjusted for motion, tilting the plane delicately, throttling with subtle finesse, coaxing the craft to remain steady. A shadow of doubt flickered in his mind. Would the wings hold? Could the fuselage bear the tension of his maneuvers? Yet, he pushed the questions aside, knowing that thought without action was useless. Survival depended not on pondering uncertainty but on responding to it with exactitude. Moments stretched unbearably. Inch by inch, the distance closed, the deck rising to meet him like a lifeline. Below, crewmen braced against rails, fingers gripping ropes, eyes wide, hearts synchronized to the rhythm of the descending plane. The aircraft quivered as a sudden gust caught the port wing, threatening to pitch it violently off course. O'Hara's reflexes surged, bank, throttle, tilt. The Hellcat shivered but obeyed, inching forward under the delicate control of its pilot's hands, the margin between disaster and success shrinking with every heartbeat. He recalled, almost without thought, the words of his old instructor. "You do not fly the plane, you negotiate with it. Listen to it, understand it, and it will take you where you must go." In that moment, the words were not abstract advice but life itself. He felt the aircraft's rhythm, anticipated its tendencies, and allowed instinct to guide decisions that logic alone could not dictate. The Pacific wind, the moving deck, the trembling fuselage, all became elements in a delicate dance, one a step away from catastrophe. Then came the final challenge, alignment. The deck was no longer a distant line but a living surface, shifting with the carrier's roll, heaving with the motion of the waves. Every microsecond mattered. O'Hara adjusted throttle and tilt in tiny increments, aligning the wheels with the deck's narrow strip, compensating for sway, for lift, for the ghost of a tailless plane's erratic tendencies. He felt a surge of vertigo, an awareness of the vast drop beneath him, and yet his focus remained unbroken. Survival required nothing less than complete concentration. He felt the wheels graze the deck, but only briefly. The plane lurched violently. The next second, a violent jolt tore through the fuselage. The flight deck erupted into shouts and whistles as crewmen braced for impact. The flight deck erupted into shouts and whistles as crewmen braced for impact. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended. The roar of the engine, the slap of wind, the hum of the carrier's machinery all blending into a single, tense chord. Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara felt every vibration reverberate through his body as the Hellcat's wheels made contact with the deck. Sparks flew where metal kissed steel, a fleeting signal of friction, of force, of life narrowly spared. The plane shuddered violently, teetering on the knife edge between control and chaos, yet it remained upright. Miracles, he thought, sometimes come with a jolt of fire. The crew on deck exhaled as one. Some collapsed into knees, others clutched the rails as if holding the world together. The flight deck, scarred by years of training, war, and routine landings, had never hosted a performance quite like this. O'Hara's Hellcat, stripped of its tail, skidded across the deck like a stubborn beast, each shudder a note in the symphony of survival. Fire crews and crash teams were ready to respond, yet the danger seemed to pass almost on its own, guided by the skill and sheer will of the pilot. There was no time to cheer, only a stunned, silent acknowledgement of what had just occurred. Inside the cockpit, O'Hara's hands trembled slightly, though his focus never wavered. He guided the plane to a stop, keeping it from careening into barriers, nets, or fellow sailors. Each micro-adjustment mattered, a slight tug on the yoke, a fraction of throttle, a delicate application of brakes. The fuselage groaned, as if protesting the ordeal, but remained intact. Slowly, deliberately, he killed the engine, the sudden quiet a stark contrast to the relentless roar of moments before. And for a few seconds he simply breathed, listening to the muted groan of his Hellcat and the quiet murmur of disbelief around him. The first to reach him were the crash crew, moving quickly yet cautiously along the deck. They circled the plane, inspecting for fuel leaks, structural damage, anything that could ignite catastrophe. Their eyes were wide, a mixture of professional scrutiny and awe. How could a plane, bereft of its tail, have returned safely? They exchanged glances that spoke volumes. This was no ordinary landing, no textbook emergency. This was a testament to human skill, instinct, and perhaps fortune. O'Hara removed his helmet slowly, revealing a face pale but determined, eyes bright yet weary. He gave a small nod to the crew, an acknowledgement without words that all was, for the moment, survived. The carrier captain, standing atop the bridge, had watched the entire ordeal through binoculars. A mixture of relief and astonishment filled him as he scribbled a note to report the event. Such landings were rarely recorded in manuals, rarely anticipated by even the most seasoned officers. O'Hara's landing would ripple through the ship, whispered from one sailor to the next, becoming legend almost instantly. The quiet awe that followed was punctuated only by the subtle groan of the landing gear, the faint smell of burnt rubber, and the rhythmic slap of ocean waves against the hull below. In those moments of calm after chaos, O'Hara allowed himself to reflect, not on glory, but on survival. He thought of the precise adjustments, the instinctive corrections, the impossible calculations that had guided him safely to the deck. And he thought, fleetingly, of the many who had not returned from similar missions, of comrades lost to sudden fire or cold ocean. Survival carried no triumph, it only carried the weight of memory, a knowledge of how thin the line between life and death truly was. And yet, amidst that reflection, a quiet satisfaction lingered. He had done what few could even imagine. The crew slowly approached, some offering hands to steady him as he stepped from the cockpit. O'Hara moved carefully, aware of every motion, every potential spark or hazard. The plane, resting finally in stillness, bore silent testimony to the ordeal it had endured. Officers whispered in hushed tones, recounting each microsecond of the landing, replaying it in their minds with disbelief. How had he managed to negotiate a plane without a tail onto a moving, pitching deck? The answer, they suspected, lay in a combination of instinct, experience, and courage that could scarcely be taught. And yet, the story was far from complete. Landing was only the first chapter. There were questions to answer, reports to file, explanations to provide. Engineers would soon examine the aircraft, seeking to understand how it had survived both the forces of gravity and the unpredictable hand of fate. The crew, still wide-eyed and muttering among themselves, would retell the story countless times, each recounting amplifying the sense of awe, disbelief, and respect. For now, though, the carrier deck was quiet, save for the gentle hiss of cooling engines, the faint groan of stressed metal, and the deep, steadying breaths of a pilot who had cheated disaster. Once engines cut, silence fell. But the mission was far from over. He had to explain how a plane with no tail had returned safely, and the story of his landing would soon spread like wildfire across the fleet. The story of his landing would soon spread like wildfire across the fleet. The USS Essex buzzed quietly beneath a sky painted in the soft hues of late afternoon, but aboard the ship, a different kind of electricity filled the air. Sailors whispered in the mess halls, officers murmured in the corridors, and pilots huddled in corners, sharing the unbelievable tale of a Hellcat returning without a tail. It was the kind of story that seemed too improbable to be true, yet every detail was confirmed. Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara had survived what many considered an impossible flight. Word traveled quickly, first among the men who had witnessed it, then spreading to those who had only heard rumors. The landing became an instant legend, not just for its miraculous outcome, but for what it represented: skill, courage, and the fragile thread by which survival hangs in the theater of war. Fellow pilots marveled at the tale, some skeptical at first, refusing to believe that physics could yield to human will alone. Others, who had flown enough missions to understand the capriciousness of fate, nodded knowingly, their expressions a mix of awe and quiet envy. O'Hara himself did little to embellish the story. To him, it was a matter of survival, a sequence of necessary actions dictated by circumstance, skill, and instinct. When interviewed by fellow pilots, he described the flight in measured terms: the sudden failure, the uncontrollable swaying, the need to constantly adjust for wind and deck movement. He spoke calmly, almost clinically, detailing the maneuvers without dramatization. Yet, even in his understated account, the sheer audacity of the feat was undeniable. Each listener recognized it. A normal pilot could not have survived that landing. Among the crew, the story took on a life of its own. Sailors relayed the tale in hushed voices during watches, embellishing details only slightly, always returning to the core truth: the tale less plain, the skilled pilot, the improbable landing. Officers discussed the implications, marveling at both O'Hara's instinctive genius and the aircraft's resilience. The landing became a topic in every corner of the carrier, from the engine room to the bridge. Even those who had never seen the event were swept up in its awe, imagining the trembling fuselage, the sparks flying along the deck, the concentrated determination of a pilot negotiating impossible odds. Technical discussions followed. Engineers examined the Hellcat, attempting to reconcile the reality of the landing with their understanding of aerodynamics. How had the fuselage survived the stresses of a tailless approach? How had O'Hara maintained control? Each analysis deepened the sense of marvel. Within the technical language lay a quiet recognition: what O'Hara achieved bordered on the miraculous. Survival in such circumstances was usually left to chance. Here, human skill and calm, precise action had rewritten the odds. The landing also affected morale across the carrier. In a theater of war where fear and uncertainty were constants, the story became a beacon of hope. Sailors and pilots found inspiration in the tale, a reminder that, even in the most dire circumstances, courage, skill, and quick thinking could bend fate in their favor. Conversations shifted subtly. Confidence rose among young pilots, who now looked toward their own missions with a mixture of nervous anticipation and quiet optimism. The impossible had been done. Perhaps, they thought, it could happen again. O'Hara, meanwhile, returned to his duties with the same calm demeanor that had guided him through the flight. He avoided heroics, focused on the ongoing missions, and treated inquiries with modesty. Yet, in private, he reflected on what had occurred, on the thin margin between disaster and survival. He considered the subtle interactions of wind, velocity, and human reflex, the exact adjustments that had prevented catastrophe. He recognized that luck had played its part, yet skill had been the difference between life and death. This reflection would stay with him for the remainder of his career, a quiet reminder of mortality and mastery intertwined. As the story spread beyond the deck, other pilots began to recount similar, miracle, flights in hushed tones. Each account reinforced the sense of awe surrounding O'Hara's feat. The tailless Hellcat became more than an incident, it became a symbol. A representation of human ingenuity under pressure, the delicate balance of risk and decision, and the extraordinary capabilities that emerge when survival hangs by a single thread. The Pacific Theater, with all its chaos and danger, had produced yet another story that would echo for years in memory and conversation. Yet, admiration didn't erase the dangers of the mission. Engineers would soon examine the wrecked plane, and O'Hara knew that understanding the damage could reveal the thin line between life and death he had just walked. Understanding the damage could reveal the thin line between life and death. In the hangar bay of the USS Essex, engineers gathered around the Hellcat, their faces a mixture of curiosity, disbelief, and professional rigor. Panels were removed, instruments scrutinized, and structural integrity tested. The tail section, or rather the absence of it, told a story no diagram could illustrate. Metal sheared, hydraulic lines frayed, the fuselage strained against forces it was never designed to endure. And yet, somehow, the aircraft had returned in one piece, a testament to both engineering resilience and the pilot's extraordinary skill. Lieutenant Commander O'Hara watched quietly, leaning against the side of the plane. He had long since learned that understanding machines was as important as flying them. Every pilot respects the invisible conversation between man and metal, and this conversation had reached its climax in a flight none would soon forget. Engineers poked and prodded, their hands tracing the jagged edges where the tail had been torn away, their instruments measuring stress points, metal fatigue, and wing alignment. Each reading confirmed what they already knew intuitively. This plane should not have flown. And yet it had. The room was thick with the scent of oil and smoke, a quiet reminder of the friction and heat endured during the landing. Sparks from the deck had left marks on the landing gear, yet the struts had held, absorbing shock in a way that belied their design limits. Engineers murmured among themselves, discussing load distribution, center of gravity, and the unusual way O'Hara had adjusted the throttle and yoke to compensate. In their technical language, they expressed astonishment, the subtext clear: this was a flight that defied probability. Some of the more seasoned engineers shook their heads, recalling similar incidents in the past, but none quite like this. There had been emergency landings, structural failures, and mid-air miracles, yet the combination of a tailless aircraft, a moving carrier deck, and a calm pilot at the controls was unique. They compared the stress patterns to standard calculations, mapping forces that should have torn the fuselage apart. And through it all, one conclusion remained unavoidable: survival was owed as much to the pilot's intuition as to the aircraft's resilience. O'Hara recounted the flight for the engineers in quiet, precise terms, careful not to dramatize events. Each adjustment he had made, every countermeasure, every instinctive correction was described methodically. The engineers nodded, some scribbling notes, others replaying mental calculations to understand how a combination of torque, lift, and sheer human ingenuity had prevented catastrophe. They discussed hypothetical scenarios, testing assumptions about how much a plane could handle, and each time, the conclusion returned to the same, inescapable truth: without O'Hara's skill, the Hellcat would have been wreckage at the bottom of the Pacific. Beyond the mechanics, there was a subtle lesson in human resilience. Pilots like O'Hara were trained not only to operate machines but to extend the limits of possibility when survival demanded it. The balance between engineering knowledge and improvisation had been tested in an extreme crucible, and the result was almost miraculous. The tailless Hellcat became a silent instructor, a living diagram of what could happen when a man's mind and a machine's capacity intertwined under pressure. The examination extended beyond structural integrity. Discussions emerged about training protocols, how other pilots might respond in similar emergencies, and what could be learned to prevent future failures. The event highlighted the fine margin between standard procedure and improvisation, between textbook calculations and instinctive action. For the engineers, the lesson was both technical and philosophical. Machines are powerful, but it is the human element, the calm mind, the steady hand, that often tips the scales between disaster and survival. As they concluded their analysis, O'Hara stood quietly, contemplating the fragile balance that had saved him. The aircraft, scarred and battered, bore witness to a flight that defied expectations. It was more than a mechanical marvel. It was a story etched into metal, a silent chronicle of courage, precision, and the unpredictable poetry of survival. Engineers packed away their instruments, exchanged nods of quiet respect, and allowed the pilot a moment to reflect, a rare acknowledgement of what had transpired beyond calculations and theories. As the engineers worked, O'Hara quietly reflected: surviving the flight was one thing, but living with the memory, the raw fear, the razor-thin margins, was another. And yet, he would fly again. He would fly again. But beneath the calm exterior of Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara, a quiet storm lingered. Surviving a tailless landing was one thing, living with the memory of it was something else entirely. Each night, as he lay in his bunk aboard the USS Essex, the image of the trembling Hellcat, wings swaying violently in the gusts, flickered behind his eyelids. The memory was not nightmarish in the conventional sense, but it carried a persistent weight, a quiet awareness of how fragile life truly is in the theater of war. O'Hara had flown countless missions before, faced enemy fire, dodged flak, and navigated storms. Yet this flight was different. It had required not speed, nor aggression, nor even cunning, but a patient, precise negotiation with both machine and circumstance. The stakes had been absolute, the difference between life and death condensed into every twitch of a yoke, every adjustment of throttle, every fraction of instinctive timing. The experience left a residue in his mind, a delicate tension between fear and mastery that would linger long after the deck beneath him had settled. He found solace, as many pilots did, in routines. Maintenance checks, briefings, and pre-flight inspections became meditative acts, a way to anchor himself in the predictability of procedure. But even in these controlled moments, his mind drifted back to the flight, the sway of the fuselage, the lurch of the wings, the whine of the engine under impossible strain. Memories of fellow pilots who had not returned from similar missions haunted him gently, not as horror, but as a quiet reminder of mortality. Each recollection reinforced the thin line he had traversed, a line only experience, skill, and instinct had kept him from crossing. Letters from home offered another layer of reflection. Words from family, from friends, reminders of ordinary life on the distant shore, provided both comfort and contrast. The mundane, letters about meals, the weather, a child's drawing, stood in stark relief against the extraordinary circumstances of flight and war. They reminded him that life outside the cockpit existed, and that the choices he made in those brief, critical moments determined whether he could return to it. The calm, patient tone of the letters mirrored the calm he needed while piloting a plane that should not have been able to fly. O'Hara also observed the reactions of his peers. Pilots who had flown alongside him, who had heard the story of his miraculous landing, expressed a mixture of awe and quiet envy. Their admiration was tempered by understanding. Anyone could find themselves in a similar peril, and few would emerge unscathed. For O'Hara, this reinforced a sense of responsibility, not heroism, not pride, but a quiet recognition that the example of survival carried meaning. To demonstrate calm, precision, and focus under unimaginable stress was perhaps the truest measure of a pilot's skill. Sleep often eluded him, not because of terror, but because the mind refused to settle after confronting such precise danger. He would replay sequences, test scenarios, and imagine alternative outcomes. Each imagined failure sharpened his reflexes, honed his intuition, and deepened his understanding of flight under extreme conditions. In this way, the memory of the flight became a training ground, a silent rehearsal for the next mission. Even in quiet reflection, the lessons of survival were inescapable. Yet, the psychological burden was not merely technical. It was human. The awareness of mortality, the recognition of how thin the line between life and death had been, shaped his interactions, his choices, and his perspective. Every mission that followed carried a quiet reverence for chance, for skill, and for the unpredictable rhythms of war. And while O'Hara remained outwardly calm and professional, inside, he carried the memory of a flight where instinct and courage had converged to defy the ordinary limits of survival. The war still raged, and soon O'Hara was called back into the air. This time, he faced another mission, yet nothing could erase the memory of the flight where he had danced with death and returned unbroken. Nothing could erase the memory of the flight. Among his peers, Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara's miraculous landing became legend almost instantly. The story traveled quietly at first, whispered between pilots in the ready room and over mugs of coffee in the mess hall. Then, like a soft wind gathering momentum, it spread through the ranks of the USS Essex, finally reaching officers and sailors who had not even witnessed the landing firsthand. In each retelling, O'Hara remained calm, almost unassuming, yet his peers could not help but sense the extraordinary courage and skill behind the feat. Pilots who had flown alongside him admired his composure. Some had faced danger in their own missions, engine failures, enemy fire, stormy landings, but the sheer improbability of controlling a tailless Hellcat on a moving carrier elevated O'Hara's actions into a category all their own. They did not celebrate recklessness. They celebrated mastery under impossible odds. And while O'Hara himself remained modest, the story inspired a quiet sense of reverence among those who understood the razor-thin margins between survival and disaster in the air. The crew, too, found themselves transformed by the tale. Sailors who had braced for a crash that never came exchanged quiet nods of disbelief and awe. The deckhands, maintenance crews, and officers alike marveled at the courage required to negotiate such a perilous landing. The story became part of the ship's living memory, retold in hushed tones during night watches, at mealtime, and even in letters home. It was not a tale of glorified heroics, but of skill, precision, and the quiet strength of a pilot refusing to yield to circumstance. Humor also crept in, subtle and comforting. Pilots joked gently about the tailless menace, and how O'Hara had tamed it. Crew members teased him lightly, imagining the plane as a stubborn animal that needed coaxing rather than control. These small, understated moments reminded everyone aboard the carrier that even in a theater of war, laughter and camaraderie were vital. The story, while extraordinary, also served as a bridge between fear and comfort, between danger and the human need for connection. Beyond morale, O'Hara's feat provided practical lessons. Younger pilots observed his composure and technique, recognizing the importance of calm, measured action in crisis. They studied the landing, analyzing how instinct, training, and rapid decision-making combined to defy catastrophe. In this way, the story transcended anecdote, becoming a subtle but powerful teaching tool. Survival, they learned, was as much about patience and precise judgment as it was about speed or aggression. O'Hara himself never sought recognition. He returned to his duties quietly, performing each mission with diligence and care. Yet his peers naturally elevated him to a position of respect, a model of courage tempered by skill. He became, without ostentation, a figure whose example reassured and inspired. The fleet, operating in the vast, uncertain expanse of the Pacific, found in his story a quiet anchor, a reminder that, even amid the chaos of war, human ingenuity and composure could prevail. The landing also reinforced bonds among the crew. Witnessing such a precise act of survival underscored the shared vulnerability of life at sea and in the air. Sailors and pilots alike found a renewed appreciation for one another's skill and courage. Each mission carried with it the tacit acknowledgement of danger, but also the unspoken knowledge that dedication and calm could tilt the scales, even in the most extraordinary circumstances. But while tales grew, O'Hara remained humble. He focused not on glory, but on the next mission, the next landing, the next battle, ever aware that luck alone had spared him that day. Luck alone had spared him that day. But Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara knew it was more than luck. It was skill, experience, and the fragile synergy between human instinct and machine that had guided him safely onto the carrier deck. In the quiet moments between missions, he reflected on the precariousness of life in the Pacific theater, the ocean vast, the sky unpredictable, the enemy unseen yet always present. Survival was rarely absolute, and the margin between life and death was often measured in inches, fractions of a second, or the slightest correction at exactly the right moment. O'Hara's reflections were not morbid, they were contemplative. He thought of his comrades who had not returned from similar missions, of planes that never touched down again, of the silent graves beneath the waves. Each loss reminded him that war was a sequence of choices and chance, a series of fragile balances maintained by skill, courage, and circumstance. His miraculous landing had been one act within this vast mosaic, a moment where focus and composure had bent fate just enough to preserve life. Yet he understood that such moments were rare, and that each flight carried the quiet potential for catastrophe. He also contemplated the invisible burdens carried by every pilot. The mental discipline required to maintain calm in the face of terror was immense, yet necessary. Fear could not be ignored, it had to be acknowledged, understood, and harnessed. O'Hara had learned this during the flight where his tail had failed. Every twitch of the yoke, every adjustment of throttle, every tilt of wings required not only precision, but the ability to remain emotionally composed. In this way, the psychological weight of survival became inseparable from the technical skill of flying itself. Letters from home offered a gentle counterpoint to these reflections. Words of love, humor, and mundane life on distant shores reminded him that life existed beyond the theater of war. They provided a subtle anchor, a reminder of what he was fighting to preserve. Yet they also reinforced the fleeting nature of each day in the Pacific. One moment, life was ordinary and safe; the next, a gust of wind or a mechanical failure could rewrite everything. O'Hara's landing had been extraordinary precisely because it defied this reality, a fragile triumph in a universe ruled by uncertainty. He thought also of the human element on the carrier, the crew who had witnessed the landing, the engineers who had inspected the plane, the pilots who had marveled at his calm. Each person contributed to the delicate ecosystem of survival, skills supporting skill, awareness reinforcing awareness. O'Hara's act, while singular, was inseparable from the collective effort of the men who prepared, supported, and observed him. Reflection revealed not just personal triumph, but the intricate network of cooperation, training, and trust that underpinned every successful mission. In quiet solitude, O'Hara considered the paradox of war. It demanded aggression and precision, courage and composure, yet it was ruled by chance. The tailless landing, the miracle on the carrier deck, embodied this paradox perfectly. It was a reminder that survival often depended on the interplay between human skill and unpredictable circumstances, on the ability to adapt in real time to forces that defied expectation. And it was a lesson he carried into every subsequent mission, shaping his approach not only to flight but to life itself. The Pacific remained vast, indifferent, and unpredictable. Yet each time O'Hara climbed into the cockpit, he did so with calm, focus, and a quiet understanding of the fragile line he walked, a line between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between survival and oblivion. Each time O'Hara climbed into the cockpit, he did so with calm, focus, and a quiet understanding of the fragile line he walked. That line, traced across the endless Pacific, between survival and disaster, between human skill and the capriciousness of fate, became the defining story of his career. Lieutenant Commander James O'Hara's tailless landing was more than a singular act of courage. It was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the precision of training, and the subtle, unbreakable bond between man and machine. The story traveled far beyond the USS Essex. Other carriers, squadrons, and naval bases heard whispers of the miraculous landing. Pilots and sailors alike were inspired, not merely by the drama of the event, but by the calm, measured approach O'Hara had taken in the face of extraordinary danger. Young aviators studied the landing, analyzing each decision, each micro-adjustment, each instinctive correction. Instructors cited it as an example in training programs, emphasizing composure, situational awareness, and the importance of negotiation with the aircraft under extreme circumstances. O'Hara himself remained modest. He never claimed heroics, never sought accolades, and treated inquiries with quiet dignity. Yet his peers and subordinates could not help but revere him, not for fame, but for the example he embodied, courage tempered by discipline, instinct guided by experience, and survival achieved through focus rather than luck alone. His story became a quiet beacon, a reminder that even amid the chaos of war, human skill and calm could tilt fate in favor of life. The tailless Hellcat, scarred and resilient, remained a symbol on the hangar deck. Engineers would often point to its stress lines and tell the story to new recruits, highlighting the extraordinary circumstances that had brought the aircraft safely home. For O'Hara, it was a tangible reminder of the delicate balance between fragility and strength, between risk and mastery. The plane bore silent witness to a feat that textbooks could not capture and manuals could not explain, a living, breathing testament to the improbable triumph of human skill. More than the technical marvel, however, was the human resonance of the event. Sailors whispered it during quiet watches, officers recalled it in briefings, and pilots reflected on it during long flights over vast, indifferent seas. It was a story that combined danger, ingenuity, and quiet heroism, a story that reassured those who faced peril that survival was possible, even against staggering odds. O'Hara's landing became part of the shared culture of the fleet, a tale that taught, inspired, and reminded all who heard it of the extraordinary potential within ordinary men. In the end, the legacy of that day rested not solely in the landing itself, but in what it represented, the capacity of a calm, experienced mind to navigate chaos, the importance of focus when every variable seems stacked against survival, and the subtle interplay of human skill, courage, and chance. Lieutenant Commander O'Hara's flight was a narrative of life negotiating with death, of a man asserting mastery over circumstance, of the delicate poetry of survival in the heart of war. The Pacific stretched endlessly, indifferent to triumph or tragedy. Yet on that November day, amid wind and waves, a tailless Hellcat touched down against impossible odds, leaving behind a story that would echo quietly through history, a reminder of the extraordinary courage and precision that ordinary men can summon when faced with the edge of disaster.